My sister stole our great-grandfather's Medal of Honor. She replaced it with a cheap replica and sent it to me in a Christmas box delivered right to the museum where I work. I didn't feel anger at first, just a cold, hollow space where my family's history used to be. How do you even begin to confront a betrayal so deep? It was wrapped in holiday paper. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss how this story of quiet cold justice unfolds. My name is Marion Holloway, and I am 42 years old. For a living, I manage the past. As the head of archives at the National History Museum in Washington, D.C., my world is one of order of climate control of stories carefully preserved in acid-free paper and silent, heavy vaults. My sanctuary smells like old parchment and wood polish, a place where every fact is cross-referenced, and chaos is kept firmly on the other side of the heavy oak doors. It's a piece I've worked hard to build both professionally and personally. That piece, however, has always been fragile, especially when it comes to my family. There is one object, one piece of my own history that I treasure above all others. It's not locked away in the museum, but it might as well be. It's our great-grandfather's Medal of Honor awarded posthumously for his actions in the Battle of the Bulge. It isn't just a piece of bronze. It's a physical link to a man I never met, a tangible piece of our family's soul, representing a kind of sacrifice and integrity I've spent my life trying to honor. It's the anchor of our legacy. Normally, it resides in a specialized climate-controlled display case in my apartment. But for the last 6 months, my entire building has been undergoing a massive security and fire suppression system overhaul. It was a necessary upgrade, but it meant my personal defenses were down. So I did the only logical thing. I entrusted the medal to the one place I thought was unconditionally safe. I drove it to my parents' house and watched my father place it in his heavy fireproof safe. I thought it was secure. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was believing that my younger sister, Tessa, had finally outgrown her particular brand of entropy. Tessa is a whirlwind of failed Etsy stores, half-baked life coaching schemes, and a permanent sense of entitlement. Our relationship exists at a carefully maintained distance. I love her, but I don't trust her with my Wi-Fi password, let alone my peace of mind. I learned long ago that the only way to manage her chaos was to keep her on the periphery of my well-ordered life. But the thing about family is that the periphery is never as far away as you think. They always have your address. The morning of December 24th has a unique kind of stillness in a place like the museum. Most of the staff had already left for the holiday, leaving behind a skeletal crew and the quiet hum of the building's climate control systems. I was in my office finishing the final archival report of the year when one of the security guards appeared at my door. He was holding a plain brown cardboard box. It was not a museum courier. It was from one of those app-based delivery services, the kind you use for a late-night food order, not for a package being delivered to a federal institution. This was the first detail that felt wrong. The box was medium-sized, wrapped in packing tape with a startling lack of precision. It was addressed to me by name here at the museum. The guard set it on the corner of my desk like it was an uninvited guest. My phone buzzed on the desk beside it. The screen lit up with a name I both knew and dreaded, Tessa. I let it ring twice before answering, bracing myself. Her voice a little too bright and sing-songy chirped through the speaker. "Merry Christmas Eve, sis. Did it get there yet?" I looked at the box. "Did what get here, Tessa?" "Just a little surprise," she said. "I wanted you to have something special to open. Let me know what you think." Before I could respond, she'd already hung up. I stood there, the forced cheerfulness of her voice still echoing in my ear. A surprise from Tessa was never just a surprise. It was an obligation. It was the opening move in a game I never agreed to play. I stared at the box, not with curiosity, but with a deep sense of weariness. Just as I reached for it, intending to take it down to my car and deal with it later, a familiar voice cut through the quiet. "That looks a bit out of place, Marion." It was Mr. Albright, the museum's director. He was a man in his late 60s, old school in every sense of the word. He wore tailored tweed jackets, his silver hair was always perfectly combed, and nothing, absolutely nothing, escaped his notice. His own background was in historical appraisal, and his eye for detail was legendary. He had been walking through the empty halls on his final round before the holiday closure. He stepped into my office, his gaze immediately landing on the box. He didn't move closer, just observed it from the doorway. His sharp blue eyes, accustomed to spotting forgeries and imperfections from 10 paces, narrowed ever so slightly. He was completely still for a long moment, a silence that was far more unnerving than any question he could have asked. I offered a weak smile, trying to dismiss the tension that was slowly building in the room. It is a bit odd. It's just a Christmas gift from my sister. She's always been one for grand last-minute gestures. Mr. Albright didn't return the smile. He took 2 steps closer, his focus still locked on the package. His gaze wasn't just looking at the box, it was assessing it, cataloging its flaws. The careless tape, the cheap cardboard, and something else I hadn't even noticed. Tessa, in an attempt to make her special gift look more official or perhaps more whimsical, had sealed the back flap with a blob of dark red wax stamped with a generic fleur-de-lis design. It was the kind of thing you'd find in a cheap calligraphy set. To her, it was probably a charming detail. To a man like Mr. Albright, it was an amateurish tell. He leaned forward slightly, not to get a better look, but as if to confirm a diagnosis he'd already made. The silence stretched for another few seconds. It was the kind of focused quiet you find in a lab, right before a discovery is announced. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, stripped of all warmth. It was the voice he used when an intern mishandled a priceless manuscript, or when a budget proposal was riddled with errors. It was his voice for serious, unadorned fact. "Marion, don't touch it." I froze my hand, hovering just above the cardboard. I think I laughed a short, nervous sound that died in the stillness of my office. "It's all right," I said. "It's just Tessa being overly dramatic." He shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the package. That wax seal, he said, his tone low and precise. "It's a cheap polymer blend, not true shellac. The impression is shallow, the edges are uneven. It was made with a cold stamp. It's a counterfeit, a poor one at that." He pointed a single decisive finger at the box. "This is not a gift." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and absolute. He wasn't speculating. He was stating a professional conclusion. In his world, a counterfeit seal on the outside hinted at a counterfeit object on the inside. It was a fundamental rule of appraisal. The presentation tells you as much as the piece itself. My sister's attempt at being fancy had inadvertently sent up a red flag to one of the few people on Earth trained to recognize it instantly. The box was no longer just a surprise for my sister. It was an anomaly. It was an object that had failed a critical test before it was even opened. The air in the room grew colder. The quiet hum of the archives suddenly felt like a warning siren. My breath caught in my throat, not from fear, but from a sudden, sickening premonition. Mr. Albright straightened up, his face a mask of professional concern. "You should open that," he said, "but do it carefully, and I'd like to be here when you do." Following Mr. Albright's instruction, my movements became slow and deliberate, as if I were handling a newly discovered unstable artifact. I didn't take the box to my desk. Instead, I carried it to the large, sterile examination table in the center of my office, the one usually reserved for reviewing historical documents under bright, unforgiving light. Mr. Albright pulled on a pair of white cotton archivist's gloves from a dispenser by the door, a purely instinctual gesture for him. He didn't offer me a pair. This was my mess, my family's chaos invading his sanctuary. He was an observer, a witness to the unfolding breach of protocol. I used a small, sharp letter opener to slice through the packing tape, my motions precise and clean. The cardboard flaps fell open with a soft sigh, revealing a nest of cheap plastic bubble wrap. There was no card, no note, just the object swaddled in plastic. I carefully lifted it out. The weight was the first thing that hit me. It was wrong. All wrong. Our great-grandfather's metal had a specific dense heft to it, a weight that spoke of its solid bronze core and the gravity of its history. This felt light, almost hollow, like a cheap souvenir. My fingers worked at the plastic, peeling back the layers until the object was finally free. And there it was. Lying in my gloved hand was a replica of the Medal of Honor. At a quick glance, it looked the part. The same iconic five-pointed star. The same light blue ribbon with its cluster of white stars. But my mind, trained to see the minute details that separate the real from the reproduction, immediately started cataloging the errors. The casting of the metal was soft, the fine lines of the inscription blurred and indistinct. The blue of the ribbon was a shade too bright, a commercial dye, not the muted historic tone of the original. The texture felt slick and new. It was a ghost, a cheap, soulless copy of something sacred. I stood there staring at the fake metal in my hand, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. A cold dread, sharp and suffocating, spread through my chest. This wasn't just a thoughtless gift. This wasn't Tessa trying to be clever or creative. This was something else entirely. It was a replacement. The box, the delivery, the fake seal, it was all a charade designed to deliver this forgery into my hands. Mr. Albright stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. "Marian, what is it? What am I looking at?" I couldn't look at him. My gaze was fixed on the worthless piece of metal in my hand. "It's a copy," I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant and strange. "It's a copy of my great-grandfather's medal. The real one. The one I told you about. The one I left with my parents for safekeeping." A wave of nausea washed over me as the final horrifying piece of the puzzle slammed into place. This wasn't a gift. It was an alibi. Mr. Albright said nothing. He didn't need to. The look on his face shifted from professional curiosity to something far more serious. He recognized the gravity of what I had just implied. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. My training, my professional instincts, all screamed at me to document, to photograph, to treat the replica as evidence. But I wasn't an archivist in that moment. I was just a daughter, a granddaughter, standing on the edge of a gaping abyss. "I need to make a call," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I turned away from the examination table, leaving the fake metal lying there under the bright lights like a patient on an operating table. I walked to the far side of my office, needing the physical distance. My hands were shaking as I pulled my phone from my pocket and found my mother's name. My thumb hovered over the screen. This was the call I never wanted to make, the one where you know deep down that the answer to your question will change everything. I pressed the call button. She answered on the second ring, her voice a wave of saccharine holiday cheer that felt instantly, violently wrong. "Marian, sweetheart, Merry Christmas Eve. Is everything all right?" The question itself was a lie. Her tone was the one she used when she was trying to sell a narrative to smooth over a crack before anyone noticed it was there. It was the voice of preemptive damage control. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. "I need to ask you something important." "Of course, dear. Anything. The medal, our great-grandfather's medal, is it still in the safe?" There was a pause. It was only a second, maybe two, but in that small pocket of silence, I heard everything. I heard the frantic search for the right words, the calculation of what to admit and what to deny. I heard the lie being born. "The safe." She laughed, a brittle, unconvincing sound. "Of course it is, honey. Right where your father put it. Safe and sound." "Why would you even ask that?" I closed my eyes. Her denial was too quick, her question too defensive. She knew. She knew something was wrong. "Because Tessa sent me a gift. Mom, it just arrived." "Oh, how lovely." Her voice flooded with performative relief. "What did she send you? I hope it was something wonderful." "She put so much thought into it, you know. That's our Tessa. Always so thoughtful." The word hung in the air. Thoughtful. A word no one, not even my mother in her most generous moments, had ever genuinely used to describe my sister. It was a word chosen from a script written to obscure, to deflect, to protect. "I just received it," I said, my voice flat and cold. "I haven't opened it yet. I wanted to check on the real one first." "Oh." The single word was small, but it carried the weight of her entire failed deception. The forced cheerfulness vanished, replaced by a nervous, fluttering energy. "Well, don't you worry about a thing. You enjoy your surprise from your sister. We'll talk later, sweetheart. I have to go. Your father is calling me for dinner." She hung up before I could say another word. I stood there, phone in hand, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. She didn't just lie to me. She had actively participated in the cover-up. She wasn't an unwitting bystander. She was a co-conspirator. The cold dread in my chest solidified into something harder, heavier, and far more painful. It was the certainty of betrayal. That night, I didn't go home. Sleep was an impossible thought. The festive lights of the city seemed to mock the cold, dark knot twisting in my gut. Instead, I stayed in my silent, empty office, the fake metal now secured in a locked archival box on my desk. The initial shock had subsided, replaced by a glacial calm. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant ache, but it was now fueling a different kind of energy. It was the methodical, focused drive of an archivist with a historical record to correct. My family had created a fiction. It was now my job to uncover the truth piece by painstaking piece. I opened my laptop. The silence of the museum, usually a comfort, now felt like a sterile laboratory where I was about to dissect my own family's lies. I didn't start with angry phone calls or accusations. I started where I always do with research. I typed my sister's name into a search engine, followed by the word business. It didn't take long to find it, a website garishly designed with faux parchment backgrounds and florid cursive fonts. It was called Tessa's Historical Treasures. The tagline read, "Where history's forgotten gems are given a new life." My stomach turned. The site was a digital junkyard of counterfeit history. There were Roman coins that looked suspiciously new Victorian lockets, with modern clasps and Civil War letters written on paper that had clearly never seen the 19th century. It was a catalog of cheap reproductions marketed as priceless artifacts. And then I saw it. Tucked away on the About Us page, beneath a glamour shot of Tessa wearing a ridiculous feather boa, was a small paragraph. It was a masterclass in her particular brand of passive manipulative storytelling. It spoke of her deep, lifelong passion for history, a passion she claimed was nurtured by her family's own deep connection to the past. It read, "With the guidance of my sister Marion Holloway, a respected historian and head of archives at one of the nation's most prestigious institutions, I have learned to appreciate the delicate art of preservation and appraisal." Her name was a shield. My professional reputation, the one I had spent 2 decades building with meticulous care and academic rigor, was being used as a cheap marketing gimmick to lend credibility to her fraudulent little enterprise. She hadn't just stolen a piece of our family's history. She was actively auctioning off my professional integrity to the highest bidder, one fake Roman coin at a time. The cold calm inside me began to burn. This wasn't just a family matter anymore. She had made it professional, and that was a battlefield where I knew exactly how to fight. The first light of Christmas morning filtered through the tall arched windows of my office, casting long shadows across the floor. I hadn't moved from my chair. The glow from my laptop screen illuminated a face that felt 10 years older than it had the day before. The initial hot burn of anger had cooled overnight, settling into something far more dangerous, a cold, resolute clarity. I knew what I had to do. I sent a single concise email to Mr. Albright's personal address. The subject line read, "Urgent matter regarding museum integrity." I briefly explained what I had discovered about Tessa's website and the unauthorized use of my name and professional title. I attached a link to the site and a screenshot of the About Us page. I didn't include emotion or family drama. I presented it as what it had become, a potential liability to the institution he was sworn to protect. His reply came in less than 10 minutes. It was 2 words: my office. Now, when I walked into his spacious wood-paneled office, he was already standing by his desk, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. He hadn't changed out of the tweed jacket from the day before. I got the distinct impression he had come back to the museum the moment he received my email. He gestured for me to sit, but he remained standing, his posture radiating a quiet, controlled fury. He had the website pulled up on the large monitor on his desk. He'd already gone through it, his sharp eyes no doubt identifying every historical inaccuracy and stylistic fraud. He looked at me, his expression devoid of pity. In his eyes, I saw not an ounce of blame, but something far more powerful. I saw an ally. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "This isn't just a family dispute, Marion. This is an attack on the very principles this museum stands for: authenticity, veracity, trust. Your sister has used your name and, by extension, our name to legitimize a fraudulent enterprise. This is not something we can ignore. I simply nodded, a wave of profound relief washing over me. I wasn't alone in this. I had expected a lecture on keeping personal matters separate from work. I had anticipated being told to handle it quietly. Instead, I found a commander preparing for battle. He looked me straight in the eye, his voice firm. They have insulted a member of this institution. They have leveraged the reputation we have all worked to build for their own tawdry, dishonest gains. He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. Therefore, you will have every resource at our disposal to make this right. Our legal counsel, our experts, our full institutional backing. Tell me what you need first. In that moment, he wasn't just my boss. He was the guardian of the history my sister had so carelessly defiled. He understood that this wasn't just about a stolen medal. It was about the theft of something far more valuable. It was about the theft of truth itself. And in the silent, hallowed halls of the National History Museum, there was no greater crime. My first request was simple. I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with. I need a formal appraisal of the replica. Mr. Albright nodded, his expression grim. Already ahead of you. He picked up the phone on his desk and spoke into it. David, please come to my office. Bring your standard analysis kit. Less than 5 minutes later, David Chen, the museum's head of materials conservation and our resident expert on precious metals, walked in. He was a quiet, meticulous man whose hands had analyzed artifacts worth millions. He gave me a brief, sympathetic nod before turning his attention to his boss. Mr. Albright pointed to the archival box I had brought with me. I opened it and revealed the counterfeit metal. David didn't touch it. He simply observed it for a long moment, his expert eye scanning its surface. He put on a pair of high-magnification glasses and leaned in closer, a small, powerful light in his hand. The office was silent as he worked, the only sound being the faint click of his instruments. After what felt like an eternity, he straightened up and looked at Mr. Albright. It's a modern zinc alloy casting with a thin bronze plating, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. The wear patterns are artificially created, likely with a chemical abrasive. The ribbon is polyester. It's a decorative piece, not a historical one. Value: maybe $100 if you can find a buyer naive enough. The clinical, dispassionate assessment hit me harder than any expression of sympathy could have. $100. That was the value my sister had placed on our family's honor. Thank you, David, Mr. Albright said, his voice tight. That will be all for now. Once David had left, Mr. Albright turned back to me, his eyes dark with a controlled anger. He walked over to a bookshelf, pulled down a thick leather-bound reference volume, and opened it to a marked page. It was a catalog of military decorations and their auction records. He ran his finger down a column of figures. The last authentic Medal of Honor from that specific campaign, he said, his voice low and steady, sold at a private auction 2 years ago for $27,000. Given the provenance of your great-grandfathers and with the proper documentation, its current market value is likely closer to $30,000. $30,000. The number hung in the air, immense and obscene. It wasn't about the money. I would have never sold it, not for any price. The figure simply quantified the scale of the betrayal. It gave a name and a number to the depth of Tessa's desperation and deceit. She hadn't just swapped a priceless heirloom for a cheap trinket. She had stolen a significant financial asset, a crime that went far beyond a simple family squabble. This was no longer just about a lie. It was about larceny, grand larceny. And as that realization settled in, the last vestiges of sisterly sentiment inside me turned to ice. She had made a cold, calculated financial decision. Now so would I. Armed with the cold, hard numbers of the appraisal, I felt a new sense of purpose take hold. This was no longer just about the emotional wound of betrayal. It was now a case to be built, a timeline to be established. My grief had a new sharp edge. It was the edge of an archivist hunting for a primary source, for the undeniable piece of evidence that would lock everything into place. I spent the rest of Christmas Day in my office, not with family, but with the digital ghost of my sister's deceit. I didn't need to dig deep. Tessa had never been subtle. Her desperation always left a trail. I scrolled back through my phone's text message history, my finger moving methodically through months of silence and superficial pleasantries. I was looking for a specific window of time, the period just after I had dropped the real metal off at my parents' house for safekeeping. My heart pounded in my chest, a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread and anticipation. And then I found it. The conversation, if you could call it that, started about 6 months ago. It began with a series of increasingly frantic messages from her. The first one was casual. "Hey sis, hope you're well. Things are a little tight right now. Could you float me a few hundred? I'll pay you back next month, I swear." I had ignored it. I'd learned years ago that her promises of repayment were as fake as the Roman coins she sold online. A week later, another message. "Marion, please. I'm in a real bind. Just a small loan. I really need your help." This one I had replied to with a polite but firm no. I suggested she look into a real job or create a budget. My response had been met with a single dramatic word. Wow. The final message in the series came 2 days after that. It was different. The pleading was gone, replaced by a sullen, wounded tone. "Fine. I see how it is. I guess I'll have to figure this out on my own. Just remember you're the one who wouldn't help your own sister." At the time, I had dismissed it as typical Tessa drama and attempted emotional blackmail that I refused to engage with. I had archived the conversation in my mind under the familiar heading of Tessa's financial crises and moved on. But now, looking at the timestamps, a cold certainty washed over me. This exchange had taken place exactly 3 days after I had sent my parents a text message with a photo confirming that the metal was safely in their possession. The timeline was perfect. It was irrefutable. She had asked for help. I had refused. And then, backed into a corner of her own making, she had found another solution. She hadn't just stumbled upon an opportunity. She had gone looking for one. She had walked into our parents' home, looked at our family's most sacred heirloom, and seen nothing but a solution to a short-term cash flow problem. She saw a $30,000 exit strategy. The text messages weren't just a record of her asking for money. They were a confession. They were the motive written in her own words, time-stamped and delivered directly to my phone. I sat there in the sterile silence of my office, the pieces of the puzzle laid out before me. The fake metal, the fraudulent website, the financial appraisal, the text messages. It was a complete damning narrative of betrayal. Every piece of evidence pointed to a single ugly truth. My phone rang, shattering the quiet. The caller ID displayed a picture of my father. My hand hesitated. This was the conversation that would draw the final line in the sand. I took a deep breath and answered, putting the call on speaker. His voice was heavy with a practiced somber tone. It was the voice he used when he was about to deliver bad news. He felt he was above. "Marion, your mother told me you called. She's very upset. Is she?" I asked, my own voice devoid of any emotion. He sighed, a sound of profound parental disappointment. "We know you're upset too. And you have a right to be. What Tessa did was misguided." Misguided, I repeated the word, letting it hang in the air between us. She didn't misplace her keys, Dad. She stole a $30,000 piece of our family's history. There was a pause, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, shifting from a posture of fake sympathy to one of weary justification. "Look, your sister has been under a lot of pressure. She made a terrible mistake, but she's not a bad person. She's just fragile." The word hit me like a physical blow. Fragile. It was the word they had used my entire life to excuse her behavior. It was the label that gave her a permanent pass, a get-out-of-jail-free card for every act of selfishness, every tantrum, every lie. It was the word that defined my role in the family. She was the fragile one, and I was the strong one, the one who was expected to absorb the damage, to clean up the mess, to endure. "I know you're angry," he continued, his voice softening into a tone of patronizing reason. "But we're a family. We can handle this quietly. Don't make this into a bigger deal than it needs to be. Your sister, she's fragile. A thing like this, if it got out, It would destroy her. And there it was, the final clarifying admission. He wasn't calling to apologize. He was calling to manage me. He was calling to ask me, his eldest daughter, to swallow a grand larceny, to protect his youngest from the consequences of her own actions. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for my silence. And in that moment, the ice in my veins didn't just burn. It ignited. The strong one was done being silent. I ended the call with my father without saying another word. His plea for my silence had the opposite effect. It solidified my resolve into something as hard and unyielding as granite. The time for quiet investigation was over. The time for direct, decisive action had begun. The next morning, I walked into Mr. Albright's office. He took one look at my face and knew. "You've made a decision," he said. It wasn't a question. I replied. "I need to take a few days of personal leave. Effective immediately." He simply nodded, no questions asked. He understood this was a battle I had to fight on my own terms, away from the hallowed halls of the museum. He knew I was no longer just an archivist preserving history. I was a claimant, preparing to recover a piece of it. The 2-hour drive from Washington, D.C. to my parents' suburban home in Virginia felt different than any trip I had ever made. I wasn't going home for a holiday. I wasn't going home for a strained family dinner. I was approaching an objective. The familiar landmarks, the tree-lined streets, the quiet manicured lawns, all seemed alien to me now. I saw them not as the backdrop of my childhood, but as the scene of a crime. A place where trust had been systematically dismantled and sold for parts. As I drove, I wasn't fueled by rage. Rage is a hot, messy emotion. This was something else. It was a cold, clear sense of purpose. I was a historian on a mission. My objective was not to scream or to cry or to demand an apology. Apologies were worthless currency in my family. They were just words used to reset the cycle of dysfunction. My objective was singular. I was there to reclaim what had been stolen. I had a single archival box on the passenger seat beside me. It didn't contain the replica. The replica was evidence now safely locked away at the museum. This box contained something far more powerful. It contained the truth. Inside were pristine professional printouts of everything I had gathered. The screenshot of Tessa's website with my name on it. The formal appraisal from David Chen detailing the pitiful value of the forgery. The auction records for authentic metals highlighting the $30,000 figure. And finally, the complete time-stamped transcript of my text message exchange with Tessa, chronicling her desperate pleas for money. I was not arriving as a daughter. I was not arriving as a sister. I was arriving as an archivist with a complete documented file of provenance, appraisal, and motive. I was coming to their door armed not with emotion, but with irrefutable fact. And I knew in their world of flimsy excuses and emotional manipulation, nothing was more terrifying. I didn't knock. I used my old key, the one they never asked me to return, and let myself in. The sound of the front door opening and closing with a soft, solid click was enough of an announcement. I stepped into the familiar foyer, my shoes silent on the polished hardwood floors. The house smelled the same as it always had, a faint mixture of my mother's floral air freshener and my father's pipe tobacco. It was the scent of my childhood, a scent now tainted with the odor of deceit. They were all in the living room. It was almost too perfect, like a scene staged for my arrival. My father was in his favorite leather armchair, a newspaper resting unread in his lap. My mother was arranging a vase of store-bought poinsettias on the mantelpiece, her movements fussy and anxious. And on the sofa, curled up under a cashmere throw blanket, was Tessa. She was scrolling through her phone, a picture of blissful ignorance. 3 pairs of eyes snapped towards me as I entered the room. My father's face registered a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by a practiced look of paternal authority. My mother froze, her hand hovering over a plastic flower, a deer caught in the headlights. Tessa's reaction was the most telling. She didn't look surprised or happy to see me. She looked annoyed, as if my presence was an unwelcome interruption to her afternoon leisure. "Hello," I said. My voice was calm, even carrying across the room with a clarity that immediately commanded their attention. No one responded. They just stared, waiting for me to explain my unscheduled appearance. I didn't offer an explanation. I didn't engage in small talk about the weather or the traffic. I walked past them, my gaze fixed on the ornate antique coffee table that sat in the center of the room. It was a genuine Louis XIV piece. My father's pride and joy, a symbol of the family's supposed appreciation for history and authenticity. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, I placed the archival box on its polished surface. The sound of the cardboard scraping against the wood was loud in the suffocating silence. It was an intrusion, a foreign object in their carefully curated domestic scene. I didn't open it. I just let it sit there, a silent accusation. My mother finally found her voice, a strained, high-pitched sound. "Marion, what is this? We weren't expecting you." I know I said, turning to face them for the first time. The mask of calm composure I had worn for years had been replaced by something they had never seen on my face before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was the detached, unflinching gaze of a professional who had come to do a job. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't just awkward anymore. It was heavy with the weight of what was inside that box. It was the silence before the storm. My father was the first to break. He stood up from his armchair, his posture stiff with indignation. "Marion, what is the meaning of this? If you have something to say, say it. Stop with the theatrics." Theatrics? I met his gaze, my own voice remaining perfectly level. "I'm not here for theatrics, Dad. I'm here for an accounting." I reached into the archival box and removed the first document, placing it on the coffee table. It was the printout from David Chen, the formal appraisal. I pointed to the conclusion at the bottom of the page. "This is a professional analysis of the gift Tessa sent me. It is a zinc alloy replica with a market value of approximately $100. Tessa's head snapped up from her phone, her eyes wide with a flicker of panic. My mother put a hand to her throat. Next, I laid out the auction record from the reference book Mr. Albright had shown me. The $30,000 figure was circled in red ink. "This," I said, "is the conservative market value of the object that is supposed to be in your safe, the object that belongs to this family's history." My father's face paled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I continued my rhythm, steady and relentless, like a prosecutor laying out an airtight case. I placed the screenshots of Tessa's historical treasures on the table, my own name clearly visible in the fraudulent bio, and then the final exhibit, the time-stamped text messages. I read Tessa's last message aloud into the silent room. "Fine, I see how it is. I guess I'll have to figure this out on my own." I looked directly at Tessa. Her face had crumpled. The mask of annoyed indifference was gone, replaced by the raw, ugly face of fear. Her lower lip began to tremble, the same practiced quiver I had seen 1,000 times since we were children. The tears started to well in her eyes. It was her signature move, the one that had always worked, the one that signaled for my parents to rush in and protect their fragile, precious daughter. But this time I didn't let the performance begin. Before a single tear could fall, I spoke again, my voice cutting through her manufactured distress. Do not start. Your tears do not work here anymore." She stopped, stunned into silence. It was as if I had broken a spell. She looked at me, truly looked at me, and for the first time she didn't see her big sister, the reliable, long-suffering fixer. She saw a stranger. She looked at my parents, a desperate, silent plea for rescue. They stood frozen, unable to deploy their usual tactics in the face of my cold, documented evidence. It was in that moment of their shared, helpless silence that Tessa finally broke. "I needed the money," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush of panicked confession. "I had a debt, a bad one. I was going to pay it back. I sold it. I sold the metal. I was going to replace it. And you were never supposed to know." Her confession hung in the air, a cloud of toxic truth filling the perfectly decorated living room. You were never supposed to know. That was the heart of it all. Their entire moral code was based not on what was right or wrong, but on what they could get away with. My mother let out a small wounded sound, a soft gasp of performative shock, as if she were hearing this for the first time. I ignored her. My focus remained entirely on the three people who had orchestrated this betrayal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quiet authority of the facts I had laid out was more powerful than any shouting match could ever be. The power in the room had shifted completely and irrevocably. They were no longer the ones in control. I was. I looked from my mother's feigned surprise to my father's ashen face, and finally to Tessa's tear-stained panic. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit with the weight of her admission, forcing them to understand that their usual playbook of denials, excuses, and emotional manipulation was now utterly useless. They had been exposed not by my anger, but by their own actions. When I finally spoke, my voice was as calm and clear as when I had first walked through the door. I am going to make this very simple, I said, addressing all three of them as a single entity. The time for discussion is over. The time for excuses is over. This is what is going to happen now. I leaned forward, my hands resting on the coffee table next to the pile of evidence. My gaze was unflinching. You sold a piece of this family's history, an artifact of national significance, to pay off a private debt. You then attempted to cover up this theft with a cheap forgery and a series of pathetic lies. You have committed a felony, and you have used my name and my professional reputation to do it. I paused, letting each charge land with the force of a hammer blow. My father started to speak a weak protest, beginning with, "Now, Marion," but I held up a single hand, silencing him instantly. "I am not finished," I said. "Mr. Albright, the director of the museum, is fully aware of this situation. He has already consulted with the museum's legal team. He is prepared to stand as a formal witness on my behalf and bring the full weight of the institution into this matter." The last bit of color drained from my mother's face. The mention of an outside authority of lawyers in official proceedings was their worst nightmare. "So here is my ultimatum," I stated, my voice dropping to a near whisper, making them lean in to hear. "You have 48 hours, 2 days. You will locate the person you sold the medal to. You will use whatever means necessary. You will beg, borrow, or pay whatever it takes to buy it back. And you will return the authentic original Medal of Honor to me. If you fail, then on the morning of the third day, I will walk into the police station and file a formal report for grand larceny and fraud against all three of you. And I will not hesitate. The choice is yours." I stood up, leaving the file of evidence sitting on the coffee table. It was their problem now. I turned my back on them and walked out of the house without another word, the sound of the front door closing behind me sealing their fate. The drive back to Washington, D.C. was the quietest 2 hours of my life. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't answer when my phone buzzed twice with my mother's number. I just drove, watching the sterile gray ribbon of the highway unfold before me. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I felt a profound hollow emptiness. I had just declared war on my own family, and while it was a war, I knew I had to fight. The act of launching the first strike left me feeling drained, as if a vital part of me had been amputated. I didn't go back to my apartment. I went to the one place that felt like solid ground, the museum. I let myself into the silent sleeping building and went straight to my office. I sat in the dark looking out at the distant lights of the city, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of the loss. Not the loss of the medal, but the loss of the idea of family I had clung to for so long. I had no way of knowing what was happening back at that house, but I could picture it with perfect clarity. The initial stunned silence after I left would have given way to a frantic, panicked explosion of blame. My father, his authority shattered, would be pacing the floor, furious not at the crime, but at the consequences. My mother would be weeping not out of remorse, but out of fear for her precious, fragile Tessa. And Tessa would be at the center of the storm, the architect of her own ruin. The panic would be real now. The threat of police, of lawyers, of public disgrace was no longer an abstract concept. It was a 48-hour countdown. I could imagine the desperate phone calls. First to the shady anonymous buyer from the collector's market. A person who now held all the cards, who knew the object they possessed was not just valuable, but stolen, and could name their price. Where would they get the money? They had enabled Tessa's lifestyle for years, but $30,000 was beyond their means. There would be frantic calls to banks for loans they couldn't get, humiliating calls to friends and relatives trying to explain an unexplainable need for a large sum of cash without revealing the sordid truth. Every door they knocked on would slam shut. I felt a distant clinical pity for them, the way an historian might feel for a fallen dynasty that had brought about its own collapse. They were trapped in a prison of their own making. For 48 hours, they would experience the gut-wrenching panic and helplessness that Tessa's actions had inflicted upon me. They had chosen to protect her from the consequences of her actions for her entire life. Now they were chained to those consequences, forced to scramble in the dark to clean up a mess that was finally truly unforgivably their own. I didn't interfere. I didn't answer their calls. I just sat in the quiet dark and waited. The 48-hour deadline expired on a cold, gray morning. I sat in my office, a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, my eyes fixed on the clock on my computer screen. 9 a.m. The ultimatum had passed. I had received no calls, no texts, no emails. Just a profound and telling silence. My heart felt heavy not with disappointment, but with a grim sense of resignation. They had failed. They had made their choice. And now I had to make mine. I picked up my phone and opened it to the local police department's non-emergency contact number. My finger hovered over the screen. This was it. The point of no return. The moment where a family drama became a public record, a criminal case. Just as my thumb was about to press the call button, my office phone rang. The sharp professional trill cut through the silence, making me jump. The caller ID read, "Museum Main Entrance." I answered, my voice tense. "Marion Holloway." "Ma'am, there's a gentleman here to see you. He says his name is Arthur Holloway. He says it's urgent." My father, he was here. He hadn't called. He had shown up, a last-minute desperate gambit. "I'll be right down," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil inside me. I walked out of my office and made my way to the museum's grand marble lobby. He was standing by the information desk, looking small and out of place beneath the towering skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. He looked tired, more tired than I had ever seen him. His face was gray, his shoulders slumped, his usual air of self-importance completely gone. He was holding a small velvet-covered box in his hands. He held it out to me like a peace offering or a surrender. I didn't take it from him. I led him in silence to a small private conference room just off the lobby, a neutral space devoid of history or emotion. Mr. Albright was already there waiting. He had insisted on being present not as a boss, but as a formal witness. My father's eyes widened slightly when he saw him, realizing this was not going to be a private father-daughter conversation. He placed the velvet box on the table between us. "I did it," he said, his voice raspy. "I got it back. It cost me nearly everything I have, but I got it back." I still didn't touch the box. I looked at Mr. Albright. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped forward, put on a pair of gloves, and opened the box. There it was. Not the slick, cheap forgery, but the original. The weight of its history seemed to fill the room. The bronze had the deep, rich patina of age. The fine details of the inscription were sharp and clear. The ribbon was faded to the perfect muted shade of sky blue. It was real. It was home. Mr. Albright looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I gave him a single slow nod. The crisis was over. The object was recovered. He quietly closed the box and pushed it across the table towards me. As my fingers finally closed around it, I didn't feel the rush of victory I had expected. I just felt the quiet, profound relief of a history that had been lost, now finally restored. A few weeks passed. The metal was back in its climate-controlled case in my apartment, the new security system blinking a silent, reassuring green light. The incident was officially closed at the museum, with Mr. Albright personally ensuring my record remained pristine. Life had returned to a semblance of normal, but it was a new kind of normal, a quieter one. I hadn't spoken to my family since the day my father returned the medal. I had changed my phone number. I needed a clean slate, a firewall against the chaos I had finally ejected from my life. But I knew it couldn't last. They wouldn't just let me disappear. The silence was finally broken by an email from my mother to my work address, a place she had never contacted me before. The subject line was just one word: please." The email was short pleading. She and my father were driving to DC. They wanted to talk, to explain, to apologize. I knew what it really was. It was an attempt to renegotiate the terms of my surrender, to see if the new boundaries I had built were permeable. A part of me wanted to just delete it, to ignore them forever. But another part, the historian in me, knew that archives are not complete without a final entry. I needed to formally close this file. I agreed to meet them, but on my own terms. Not at my apartment, not at the museum. I chose a busy anonymous coffee shop downtown, a place with no history, no memories. It was a place where they would have no power. I arrived first and chose a small table in the corner. When they walked in, they looked like strangers. They seemed older, diminished, stripped of the casual authority they had always worn like a cloak. They sat down opposite me, the small table feeling like a vast empty chasm. My mother began, her voice trembling slightly. "Marion, we are so sorry. We never meant for any of this to happen." I let her speak. I listened to the familiar script of excuses. Tessa was in trouble. They were scared. They didn't think. They thought I was strong enough to handle it. They said all the words they thought I needed to hear, but the words were hollow. They were apologies for the consequences, not for the actions themselves. When she finished, a hopeful, expectant silence fell between us. They were waiting for me to say it's okay. "I forgive you. Let's go back to how things were." I took a slow sip of my coffee, looked my mother straight in the eye, and delivered the final official record. "I understand that you are sorry, but you need to understand this. Forgiveness isn't on the table. It isn't a currency we can use to purchase the past." My father started to protest, but I continued, my voice calm and resolute. "You didn't just allow a theft. You made a choice. You looked at your two daughters and you chose which one to sacrifice. You chose the one you thought wouldn't break. You gambled with my career, my integrity, and my peace of mind, all to protect her from a crisis she created. Love is not a license for betrayal." I stood up, leaving my half-finished coffee on the table. "From now on, we can be relatives. We will see each other at major funerals and perhaps the occasional wedding. But we are no longer family. The trust that holds a family together is gone. You broke it. And some things once broken cannot be repaired. They can only be archived." I walked out of the coffee shop and didn't look back. I felt no anger, no sadness. Just the quiet, clean finality of a file being closed, of a story reaching its definitive, unalterable end. 6 months later, the hushed, reverent quiet of the museum felt different. It was no longer just a professional sanctuary. It was my territory, a space I had defended and reclaimed. That evening was the official opening of a new exhibit, one that had become my passion project in the months following the incident. I had poured all my energy, all my focus into it. It was titled "Silent Hero: Stories of Courage Beyond the Battlefield." The gallery was filled with the soft murmur of patrons and the clinking of glasses. Journalists and academics milled about, studying the displays. I walked through the exhibit not as a nervous curator, but as a quiet observer of my own handiwork. My work, my story. In the very center of the main gallery, under a single focused beam of light, was a simple glass case. Inside, resting on a bed of dark blue velvet, was my great-grandfather's Medal of Honor. It wasn't just an artifact anymore. It was a testament. Its journey, its loss, and its recovery had given it a new layer of history, a new story to tell. I had written the small placard next to the display myself. It didn't mention my family. It didn't mention the theft or the betrayal. It spoke only of the medal's history, of the man who had earned it, and of the enduring importance of protecting one's heritage. Mr. Albright found me standing there, a glass of champagne in his hand. He handed it to me and stood beside me, looking at the display. "It looks right at home," he said quietly. "It is," I replied. "It finally is." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as people gathered around the case, their faces filled with a quiet respect. This exhibit was my answer, my final word. It was my way of taking the ugliest chapter of my life and transforming it into something meaningful, something that could educate and inspire. I had taken their chaos, and I had curated it into a lesson on integrity. Later that evening, as I was leaving, I paused in the empty gallery. The crowds were gone, the lights were low. It was just me and the silent sleeping artifacts. I looked at the medal one last time. My father was right about one thing. I was the strong one. But my parents had never understood what true strength was. They thought it was the ability to endure pain, to absorb damage, to carry the burdens of others in silence. They were wrong. True strength isn't about how much you can carry. It's about knowing what you must set down. It's about having the courage to draw a line and defend it, not with anger, but with the quiet, unshakable power of your own self-worth. My legacy, I realized, wasn't just the medal in that case. It was the choice I had made to protect it. It was the understanding that some things are not meant to be fixed. They are meant to be survived. And some people are not meant to be in your life. They are meant to be a part of your history. The thing about family betrayals is that they leave scars no one else can see. They teach you that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones you need protection from. But the most important lesson I learned is that you get to decide when the story of your pain ends and the story of your peace begins. You are the curator of your own life. You decide which pieces of your past belong in a display case and which ones belong in a locked vault archived forever. If this story resonated with you, and if you've ever had to choose between your family and your own well-being, please share your thoughts in the comments. You are not alone. And make sure you subscribe to the channel for more true stories about reclaiming your power, one boundary at a time.